Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I think most of you here are my students. There are a few that taught me, so I believe I'm among friends and colleagues. So I was very surprised when my good friend Professor Jaramba called me about a month ago and told me that the Law Society of Kenya wanted me to give this keynote speech. I almost fell off my seat. Pleasantly, of course. So thank you, Faith, and your team for this honor. I felt that I must honor the invitation. So let me just get onto it. I know I am keeping you from your lunch as well. In the play Waiting for Godot, the Irish playwright Samuel Beckett tells the story of Vladimir, also known as Didi, and Estragon, also known as Gogo. The two characters spend endless days waiting for someone named Godot, whom they believe will provide them with salvation. And as they wait for Godot, they pass time with conversations, physical routines, and philosophical musings. But Godot, the savior, never arrives. For more than 2 decades, we've been trying to reform policing in Kenya, hoping that our Godot, let's call our Godot democratic policing, will arrive and save us from tyranny. And in the process, much like Didi and Gogo, we have engaged in all kinds of conversations, the routines of task forces, and philosophical musings on what to do with our policing, hoping that it will become democratic, but it never does. So as you can guess, I want to talk about democratizing policing in Kenya, and I'm asking the question, are we waiting for Godot? In this keynote speech, I'd like to use the lens of administrative law, which is the subject that I'm most passionate about, to reflect on how a democracy should be policed, how Kenyans are policed, why it is difficult to reform policing in Kenya, and how we might be able to democratize our policing. I hope we're together so far. We cannot and will never be free unless and until we democratize our policing. We must tame the tyranny of the barons that we find in the criminal justice system. And towards this end, I'd like to contend that carefully designed structural interdicts offer perhaps the only viable institutional mechanism for democratizing policing in Kenya. As I like to do, I think it's always good to start from philosophical or conceptual foundations. And the question would be, how should a democracy be policed? As we all know, the work of the police is to enforce the criminal law so that crimes are prevented and social order is maintained. And to enable the police to do this work, the law grants them extraordinary and often discretionary powers to use force, to investigate, to arrest, to detain accused persons as well. But these discretionary powers can't be abused, thereby compromising the liberties of individuals and compromising the effectiveness of policing. And so for this reason, policing needs to be democratic, meaning that policing policies and practices should be formulated and implemented through processes that are participatory and accountable. So how then should policing be governed in a democracy? There are 2 ways of governing policing. On the one approach, the law grants the police discretionary powers to enforce the criminal law and lets them to get on with it. On this ex post approach, criminal laws typically confer on the police the blanket authorizations, and the police pretty much do what they wish. Civilian review boards and courts only intervene to correct instances of abuses of power and police malpractices after they have occurred. And this approach is designed to address individual instances of police misconduct, as opposed to addressing the governance shortfalls that produce such misconduct. On the second or ex ante approach, the law attempts to circumscribe the powers of the police by requiring public rulemaking and democratic oversight in the implementation of policing policies and rules. On this approach, laws and institutional mechanisms enable citizens to observe and scrutinize the substantive and procedural policy choices of criminal law enforcement. As you can guess, the ex post approach has been the dominant governance model, the claim being that policing is unique. Policing cannot be treated, or the police cannot be treated like other agencies of executive government. And a common justification for this is that confidentiality in policing is both necessary and appropriate. Hence, it is claimed that making policing transparent would allow criminals to more skillfully evade police detection. And as a result, police exceptionalism has meant that policing agencies are simply authorized to enforce the criminal law and determine what enforcement actions they can take without the public interrogating the rationality of policing policies and methods. Hence, compared to other agencies of executive government, the public often do not participate in the making of policing policies and rules. And the police often do not have to justify their policing methods and practices. The consequence is that the police largely get to do what they want, when they want, and how they want. However, it is important to appreciate that in a democracy, policing methods are matters that embody political value judgments and therefore require a careful weighing of costs and benefits. And so, they should be subject to public debate, subject to public input, subject to public interrogation. Public participation in policing decision-making is also likely to enhance the legitimacy of police actions and public trust in the police. And so, we should appreciate that policing agencies are agencies of executive government fundamentally, and like other agencies of executive government, policing agencies must formulate their methods through binding policies and rules that have benefited from public participation. And ultimately, the objective is to ensure that there are rules and performance benchmarks that guide policing actions and make their policy choices transparent to the public. That way, the public will have a say in how they are policed. That is all very good. And so, while rule-based and accountable policing is desirable in a democracy, attaining it, as you can guess, is nevertheless a difficult task for various reasons. 3 reasons suffice to illustrate. First, even where policing policies and rules are made with the benefit of public participation, it is often difficult to enforce them. Number 2, it is difficult to write rules for some areas of policing or ensure that they are followed. Number 3, policing agencies may be reluctant to enforce policies that they perceive to have been foisted on them by outsiders. What do these conceptual parameters mean for policing in Kenya? Let me now turn to the nature of policing in Kenya. And as we all know, again, those of you that study policing or the enforcement of the criminal law in this country, From colonial times to the present, policing in Kenya has taken the ex post approach. The police force is often heavy-handed, often insensitive, and typically uses excessive force in its dealings with citizens. Again, the police force is politicized and is invariably deployed as an instrument for the political repression of citizens. Our policing framework is decidedly undemocratic, it is executive dependent, and it fails to promote the constitutional values of public participation and accountability. The policing framework is undemocratic because it was designed that way. Our policing framework was constructed by the British with the primary goal of maintaining law and order with a view to preserving the colonial regime. The colonial police contained Africans through a strict law and order approach and repressive measures. We also need to see our policing framework in the context of the culture of power that we inherited from the British. It is a culture of subjugation. It is a culture of domination, not democracy. It is a culture in which government is paternalistic and despotic and decides what is best for its subjects without consulting them. It is a culture of power that dictates that the president and his minions are the law, and that their decisions must be obeyed, not questioned, irrespective of what the Constitution says. And if they are questioned, the police can readily be deployed to repress dissenting voice. And the police force is socialized to enforce this culture, using vague criminal laws that give them immense discretionary powers. In this regime policing model, the government of the day is the state, and the state is the government of the day. The government of the day exclusively determines policing policy and operations. The public is socialized that this must be the case. Policing policy is siri kali. That is the only Swahili word I know. It is siri kali and must remain so in the interest of some nebulous concept called national, or is it state security? And the line between policing policy and policing operations is invariably and deliberately blurred. And so we inherited this practice of law and order maintenance and regime policing. Hence, governments use the police to repress dissent, just like the colonial government did. Not much has changed. Thus, the police force has no meaningful autonomy from the executive. The police force firmly remains part and parcel of the national administration, formerly known as the provincial administration, and that is the entity that operates largely in informal ways and is a primary executive instrument for exercising executive authority and controlling the population. And so in our policing framework, police abuses are deliberate, and they are calculated to enable tiresome, bureaucratic microaggressions whose objective is to ensure that citizens submit to authority and do not criticize government. The question then becomes, can we transform our policing framework and stop police abuses? If so, how do we do it? So let me now turn to police reforms in Kenya. If you've been around the last or 2 decades, I've been studying policing since around 2005. I happen to be the son of a police officer. I suppose that is why I've taken an interest in policing. I wrote an article that was published in the Oxford Commonwealth Law Journal in 2005, and I was trying to look to the future and ask, can we create a democratic framework for policing in Kenya? So over the last 2 decades, that's from around 2005, we've made some efforts to reform our policing. But the reform efforts have borne little fruit. And the most comprehensive attempt was what the Ransley Task Force did in 2009. And in many ways, you can think of the Ransley Task Force as a blueprint for policing reforms in this country. Unfortunately, the government either ignored, neutered, or paid lip service to most of the reform proposals of the Ransley Task Force. I'll give you 6 of those. Number 1, the task force said, let's establish a national policing council so that it can, for example, give us a national policing policy. That council was never established, and so Kenya does not have a national policing policy. Number 2, although a national police service commission was established, it was very quickly rendered moribund, as the leadership of the National Police Service usurped its functions in practice. There's an ongoing court case on this very subject. Number 3, while the Constitution gives the Inspector General independent command over the police service, in practice, cabinet secretaries in charge of policing services continue to micromanage the police, thereby denying them operational independence. Number 4, although the National Police Service Act establishes an internal affairs unit to investigate complaints against the police and recommend disciplinary actions, there is no external oversight of these internal complaints mechanism. Number 5, contrary to the recommendations of the task force, IPOA was not established under the Constitution. Instead, it was established under a statute and stripped of critical powers that the task force envisaged that it should have. And number 6, the county policing authorities are yet to be operationalized. And so, in a nutshell, Kenya's policing framework continues to be undemocratic in critical respects. There is no public participation in the making of policing policies or their implementation. And while there is now some accountability for instances of police abuses, we remain unable to reform the formal and informal system that produces the abuses. The question is, what can we do about it? Is there hope that we can democratize policing in Kenya, that we can get to see Godot? Kenya's undemocratic policing framework has proved to be intractable because the rules of governance continue to be insufficiently institutionalized, meaning that they are all too often open-ended and neither participatory nor accountable. These policing rules are a godsend for our governments, which ably use them in overt and covert ways to subvert the progress, democracy, and the rule of law. As I said, we cannot be free. We'll never be free unless and until we democratize our policing regime as a matter of urgency. We must therefore do much more to circumscribe the powers of the coercive policing order and ensure day-to-day participation of citizens in policing and accountability of the police. And as we've seen, successive governments and the police have refused or deliberately neglected to implement the key recommendations of the Ransley Task Force. Again, while IPOA has contributed somewhat to policing accountability, its approach is limited, given that it tends to focus on individual instances of police misconduct and has done little to address the broader governance shortfalls around how policing decisions are made and implemented. So I'm getting to the end of this and I'm asking, what can we do? Is there a hope? And this is why I believe that structural interdicts, carefully structured structural interdicts might give us hope. And in this direction, I am led by 2 decisions of the High Court, which suggest that constitutional litigation and the remedy of structural interdicts can be used to democratize our policing at last. And that if carefully structured, structural interdicts can ensure that under court supervision, the government and the police work with the public to reform policing. The challenge then will be for the Law Society of Kenya, public interest litigation groups and individuals, and IPOA to fashion and structure appropriate remedies that can democratize our policing. The first decision is a case that was filed by Katiba Institute and IMBLU. Here, the High Court ordered the Cabinet Secretary in the Ministry of Interior and the Council of Governance to operationalize the community policing authorities and to do that within 6 months. The court also directed them to file an affidavit in court within 9 months indicating the status of their compliance with the first order. So far, however, your guess is as good as mine. These government agencies have not complied with these orders, and so the idea of institutionalized community policing remains still born. The second decision is again a case filed by the Law Society of Kenya against a number of police officers, one of whom is called Kithinji. Katiba Institute was an interested party in this case. Here, the court determined that the National Police Service Act and the National Police Service Standing Orders do not permit police officers to wear plain clothes and hide their identities in order to collect criminal intelligence while individuals are exercising their constitutional rights to assemble, picket, and demonstrate. The High Court made two critical orders. One was to the police that any officer deployed to ensure law and order in the course of an assembly, demonstration, or picketing must be uniformed, and that shall not in any way hide or obscure their faces, basically not hide themselves. And number two, a prohibition restraining the police from obscuring the identification, registration, or markings of any motor vehicle that they use in the process of an assembly. Again, your guess is as good as mine. The police service simply ignored these orders. They have unashamedly and unapologetically continued to wear facial masks and use unidentified vehicles during protests. Evidently, this piecemeal approach is not going to help us to democratize policing. This piecemeal approach of asking the courts to outlaw undemocratic policing practices as and after they have occurred, this will not stop the police from using these practices. And this is where the structural interdicts might offer the solution. And I know you're hungry. I'm getting to the end of the talk. I like to keep it short. I think I've tried. Have I succeeded? Thank you very much. But what might this approach entail? I think toward this end, we have much to learn from the use of what are called consent decrees in the United States. They use these consent decrees to address problematic policing practices. The consent decrees are designed to reform policing policies, rules, and practices and bring the police to comply with the Constitution and policing laws. And they serve, do I still have your attention? Thank you very much. I'm a teacher. I'm always aware of that when people are speaking around when I'm well in the process. So these consent decrees serve as a foundation for an agreed upon roadmap for reform, including measures of progress, accountability, and results. And so they create reform institutions that administrative law scholars call regulatory intermediaries. So I'm just going to give you a snippet of what this might look like in practice. The challenge for us is to figure out how do we create the necessary regulatory intermediaries so that once and for all we reform our policing. How does this work in practice? In practice, the Department of Justice files a civil action against a concerned governmental authority. It's typically a city and its policing department. Once the Department of Justice has investigated and established that there is a pattern or practice of police abuses, and in that suit, the Department of Justice asks for carefully crafted structural interdicts. The parties then enter into what is called a settlement agreement. This is a critical part of this. The settlement agreement seeks to implement the structural interdicts, like the kinds of orders the High Court was issuing in the two cases that I've mentioned, with the goal of ensuring that police services are henceforth delivered in a manner that complies with the Constitution and other laws and promotes public confidence in the police. And above all, the agreement provides clear, measurable obligations that are to be attained. So it comes with an M&E tool, with a monitoring and evaluation tool, basically. It is significant that the agreement then provides institutional structures for its enforcement. And this is something that has been lacking in our use of structural interdicts. And typically, they have two institutions. One is called a monitor. The other is called a community police commission. So let me just briefly tell you what they do. The monitor is usually a person who's experienced in law enforcement or criminal justice. Say, for example, a retired judge who's experienced in the criminal justice system. And this person is selected jointly by the parties and is responsible for overseeing the implementation of that settlement agreement. The function of the monitor is to develop a monitoring plan and conduct regular compliance and progress reviews to assess the extent of implementation of the agreement. And then on the other hand, the Community Police Commission brings together the community, the public, the stakeholders, including community organizations and youth organizations. Its main function is to review the reports and recommendations of the monitor and also make recommendations to the city and its police on the implementation of the settlement agreement. The agreement also requires the police department to develop an implementation schedule, typically within 60 days after the monitor has been appointed. The schedule should prioritize the development and implementation of policies, procedures, practices, training materials, and the training that is required to implement the agreement. And so how do the parties then know that everything has been done? And this is also made part of the court order. So this is a process that takes time. In the city of Seattle, for example, I think it's taken 10 years. Typically, you're talking about a period of 5 or so years. But when is compliance? When is a city and its police deemed to have complied fully? So the city and the police department are deemed to have achieved full and effective compliance with the agreement if they have incorporated the agreement into policy, into training manuals, into trained police officers, and ensured that there is implementation in practice. And like I said, the anticipation is that that is full and effective compliance will be achieved within a period of 5 years, but it's usually extended. So the court retains the jurisdiction and the court makes the final determination based on the M&D indicators provided by the monitor that yes, now we are happy, we have reformed the police. Conclusion. So it seems to me that nothing short of such a detailed administrative law-based approach to structural interdicts with measurable performance indicators will ensure, and institutional structures to enforce them will ensure the democratization of policing in Kenya. What is lacking from the High Court's approach to the use of structural interdicts in the policing domain are, to repeat, the legitimate institutional structures that will compel the government and the police to reform policing policies, rules, and practices. We need institutional structures that will identify shortfalls through a process of investigation, and there's obviously going to be some research that entails. Number 2, review policing records. Number 3, audit policing practices regularly, and above all, force change. It is only through such a transformative approach that we'll be able to attain constitutional and effective policing. Policing agencies, to conclude, should be governed democratically. I think it is time that we debunk the myth of police exceptionalism. We should treat them like any other agency of government. We should get rid of this culture of sirikali. They must be subject to participatory rule making, and they should be accountable for their methods, actions, and decisions. But given the autocratic culture of policing in Kenya, the misuse of police for regime policing, and the refusal of successive governments to reform policing, the impetus for reform, as you can clearly see, will not come from the government. It will not come from the police. It is up to us as the citizens to find a way to compel the police to reform. If we don't do that, nothing will change and we'll never be free. And as I see it, therefore, carefully designed structural interdicts anchored in our transformative constitution offer perhaps the only viable mechanism for democratizing policing. Using this approach, I believe we should be able to create the requisite participatory and accountable institutional structures and reform roadmap that will ensure that we finally get to see this elusive character called Godot. I thank you.